this is also a time of change for my family.
It was supposed to be another carefully managed royal appearance, brief smiles, controlled headlines, and silent departures. But when King Charles III stood beside Anne, Princess Royal, and delivered a trembling statement about the future of the monarchy, even senior aides reportedly froze in disbelief. The emotion in Anne's face was impossible to ignore. Something fundamental inside the House of Windsor had shifted. And according to whispers emerging from palace corridors, this was only the beginning of a deeply painful royal reckoning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made the moment so unsettling was not simply the appearance itself, but the atmosphere surrounding it. Reports suggest the gathering at Windsor had originally been planned as a low-profile private engagement, one designed to project calm continuity, while the monarchy quietly navigated another difficult chapter under Charles's reign. Yet almost immediately, insiders began describing an entirely different mood behind closed doors. Palace administrative staff allegedly noticed unusual last-minute schedule adjustments. Senior courtiers reportedly arrived earlier than expected, while security around several internal meeting areas was said to have tightened dramatically throughout the afternoon. Those familiar with royal operations whispered that something serious had unfolded only hours before Charles and Anne appeared together publicly. Then came the statement itself. According to various interpretations emerging afterward, Charles spoke not as a monarch delivering ceremonial reassurance, but as a father, brother, and increasingly fragile sovereign confronting the unbearable weight of legacy. Witnesses claim his voice reportedly faltered while discussing duty, sacrifice, and the responsibility owed to future generations. That phrase alone sent shockwaves through royal observers, because within palace tradition, discussions about future generations are rarely casual. They are often tied to succession, continuity, and fears surrounding the survival of the institution itself. And while Charles attempted to maintain composure, reports suggest Anne quietly stepped forward at one particularly emotional moment, grounding the king before he continued. It was subtle, but according to insiders, deeply symbolic. Because for decades, Anne has reportedly been viewed inside royal circles as the monarchy's iron backbone, the one figure capable of functioning without emotional collapse, even during moments of devastating internal strain. Yet this time, even she allegedly appeared shaken. Several palace aides later described the atmosphere afterward as somber, emotionally charged, and unlike anything they had witnessed since the final months of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Courtiers who normally exited royal events with rigid professionalism were reportedly seen unusually emotional in private corridors. Some insiders even claimed conversations continued deep into the evening between senior members of the royal household, with speculation growing that urgent discussions about the monarchy's long-term future had intensified significantly following Charles's ongoing health struggles. Royal commentators, including figures frequently associated with palace reporting such as Robert Hardman and Ingrid Seward, have long suggested that Charles's illness accelerated internal planning at levels the public has barely begun to understand. But according to whispers now emerging from Windsor itself, the emotional statement delivered beside Anne may have revealed something even more troubling. Because behind the carefully chosen words about duty and sacrifice, reportedly existed a growing fear that time inside the monarchy was moving much faster than the palace was prepared to admit. And as private conversations surrounding succession allegedly intensified, insiders began quietly questioning whether the institution Queen Elizabeth spent an entire lifetime protecting could withstand the fractures already spreading through the royal bloodline. But behind the emotional statement was a far more unsettling truth, one tied to fears about whether the monarchy itself could survive the fractures growing inside the royal bloodline. For months, reports suggested something was deeply wrong behind palace walls. Meetings were increasing. Schedules were changing. And according to several royal commentators, Anne, Princess Royal had quietly begun taking on responsibilities far beyond what the public could see. Why? Because insiders feared the institution Queen Elizabeth II spent 70 years protecting was entering its most dangerous chapter in decades. In the weeks following the emotionally charged Windsor appearance beside King Charles III, palace whispers reportedly intensified at a pace even veteran royal staff found alarming. Sources close to the royal household suggested that Charles's ongoing health struggles had forced senior figures inside the monarchy into emergency contingency planning. Long before the public fully understood the seriousness of the situation, what had once been treated as cautious preparation suddenly transformed into something far more urgent. Behind closed doors, discussions allegedly expanded beyond temporary scheduling adjustments and entered deeply sensitive territory involving succession strategy, constitutional stability, and the long-term survival of the institution itself. According to several interpretations emerging from royal commentators, Anne became central to nearly all of it. Palace staff reportedly began referring to her privately as the operational backbone of the monarchy, a figure capable of maintaining discipline and continuity, while emotional pressure spread through the family at an unforgiving speed. Unlike other senior royals who remained heavily exposed to media scrutiny, Anne allegedly operated in silence, moving through private meetings, reviewing internal structures, and quietly reinforcing areas of the institution many feared were beginning to weaken under the strain of uncertainty. Insiders whisper that her workload increased dramatically after Charles's treatment reportedly intensified, with several aides claiming Anne had become deeply involved in matters traditionally handled across multiple departments of the royal household. Yet the deeper concern was never simply Charles's health. According to palace administrative streams and royal insiders familiar with Windsor operations, growing anxiety centered around whether public confidence in the monarchy could survive another prolonged period of instability. Staff reportedly feared the institution was entering an emotionally fragile era, where every public appearance, every family interaction, and every silence carried dangerous symbolic weight. The monarchy had survived scandals before. It had survived divorces, betrayals, abdications, and devastating public backlash. But insiders allegedly worried this crisis felt different because it combined physical vulnerability at the top with growing fractures inside the royal bloodline itself. Reports suggest even William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were increasingly pulled into internal strategy discussions once reserved for only the most senior palace figures. Those familiar with royal protocol claim meetings involving William reportedly became more frequent and more serious in tone, with conversations focusing heavily on continuity, public trust, and the future shape of the monarchy after Charles. Catherine, meanwhile, was allegedly viewed by senior courtiers as one of the institution's strongest remaining stabilizing forces, particularly during a period when emotional exhaustion inside the family had reportedly reached dangerous levels. Throughout these discussions, one figure continued looming over every conversation: the late Queen Elizabeth II herself. Insiders claim her long-term vision for stability became an almost sacred reference point during private planning sessions. Senior royals reportedly revisited her philosophies about restraint, continuity, and institutional survival repeatedly, while trying to navigate the growing uncertainty surrounding Charles's reign. But as emergency meetings multiplied and rumors of secret restructuring discussions quietly spread through palace corridors, an even darker fear reportedly began emerging beneath the surface. Because according to several royal commentators, the monarchy was no longer simply preparing for transition, it was preparing for confrontation. And as those private discussions intensified, attention suddenly shifted toward one deeply controversial question the palace reportedly hoped would never become public. According to palace whispers, the greatest fear was never King Charles III's illness alone. It was what could happen after him. Behind closed doors, senior figures reportedly feared a monarchy fractured between duty and resentment, loyalty and betrayal. And at the center of that anxiety stood the growing divide between William, Prince of Wales, and Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, a wound many insiders claim never truly healed. As internal meetings surrounding succession and institutional stability reportedly intensified, attention inside the palace allegedly shifted toward a painful reality few senior royals wanted to confront publicly. According to several royal commentators, Charles had become increasingly consumed by the fear that history would remember not only his reign, but the collapse of unity within his own family. Reports suggest the king quietly hoped reconciliation between William and Harry could still be achieved before time, illness, and bitterness made such a possibility impossible forever. Yet insiders familiar with private palace conversations claim those hopes repeatedly collided with a much harsher reality unfolding behind closed doors. Because while Charles reportedly approached the crisis emotionally, Others inside the monarchy allegedly viewed it through the cold lens of institutional survival. And no figure embodied that divide more clearly than Anne, Princess Royal. Sources close to Windsor suggest Anne warned repeatedly against allowing personal grief or guilt to shape critical royal decisions during such a fragile period. To Anne, according to several interpretations emerging from palace staff, the monarchy was never supposed to function as an emotional negotiation between wounded family members. It was an institution built on continuity, sacrifice, discipline, and stability. And insiders whisper that she feared emotional reconciliation efforts, particularly under growing public pressure, could expose the monarchy to even greater internal chaos at precisely the wrong moment. That tension reportedly deepened as ongoing criticism from Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, and Harry continued casting a long shadow over palace trust. While public attention often focused on interviews, memoirs, and media narratives, insiders claim the deeper damage inside royal circles was psychological. Senior aides allegedly worried that years of public accusations and internal betrayals had created fractures impossible to fully repair. Some reportedly feared the institution itself had entered a dangerous cycle, where every attempt at reconciliation risked reopening wounds that palace staff had spent years trying desperately to contain. According to various interpretations from royal commentators, William increasingly positioned himself not simply as a brother navigating family pain, but as the future protector of the monarchy's credibility. Insiders claim his priority became institutional stability above all else. That reportedly meant maintaining boundaries many viewed as emotionally brutal but strategically necessary. Sources close to palace operations suggest William had grown deeply concerned about public confidence in the monarchy eroding further if internal conflicts continued spilling into global headlines. And as those fears intensified, senior aides allegedly began using one phrase with alarming frequency behind closed doors: irreversible damage. Reports suggest palace officials worried the royal family was approaching a point where trust, once broken repeatedly in public view, might never fully return. For Charles, however, the crisis reportedly remained painfully personal. Several insiders claim the king became increasingly emotional during discussions surrounding Harry, often reflecting privately on how decades of unresolved family pain had spiraled into something much larger than disagreement. Royal commentators even drew comparisons to some of the monarchy's darkest historical crises, from the abdication trauma that haunted George VI's reign to the devastating emotional fractures surrounding Diana, Princess of Wales, decades later. But according to whispers now emerging from within palace circles, this conflict carried an even more dangerous dimension. Because unlike past scandals centered on image alone, this crisis reportedly threatened the monarchy's future structure itself. And while the public remained fixated on the emotional war between William and Harry, insiders quietly claimed Anne had already begun preparing for something far more serious than reconciliation. But while the public focused on Harry and William, insiders claim Anne was quietly preparing for something much larger: a complete defense of the monarchy's future itself. If King Charles III represented the emotional heart of the monarchy, Anne, Princess Royal, reportedly became its iron shield. Palace insiders increasingly described her as the last uncompromising guardian of royal duty, someone unwilling to let sentiment weaken the institution her mother spent a lifetime protecting. And according to whispers from royal staff, Anne had finally reached her limit. In the aftermath of growing fears surrounding royal instability, insiders claim Anne's influence inside palace operations expanded rapidly and decisively. While Charles reportedly struggled under the emotional weight of illness, family fracture, and public pressure, Anne allegedly moved in the opposite direction, becoming colder, sharper, and increasingly determined to protect what she viewed as the monarchy's sacred core. According to several royal commentators, she had spent decades watching crises consume the House of Windsor from the inside. She witnessed the chaos surrounding the marriage breakdowns of the 1990s. She observed the devastating emotional fallout after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. And insiders suggest those experiences shaped a philosophy that now governed nearly every decision she made: duty before emotion. Reports emerging from within royal circles claim Anne repeatedly warned senior figures that allowing personal feelings to dictate institutional policy during a fragile succession period could trigger consequences far beyond a single family disagreement. To Anne, according to palace whispers, the monarchy survived precisely because previous generations were willing to separate private pain from public responsibility. And as tensions surrounding Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, continued hanging over the palace like an approaching storm, Anne allegedly became increasingly convinced stronger boundaries were no longer optional. They were necessary for survival. Sources familiar with internal palace discussions claim Anne quietly emerged as one of the central figures guiding long-term royal planning during Charles's treatment. Senior aides reportedly viewed her as the monarchy's most reliable stabilizing force, someone capable of making difficult decisions without being emotionally paralyzed by them. And according to various interpretations from royal insiders, Anne's loyalty to the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II became almost immovable during this period. Staff allegedly heard repeated references to the late Queen's belief that the institution must always come before personal comfort, personal relationships, and even personal heartbreak. That philosophy reportedly shaped every strategic discussion Anne became involved in. Courtiers privately described her approach as cold but necessary, particularly as fears surrounding royal credibility intensified behind closed doors. While some insiders reportedly sympathized with Charles's desire for emotional reconciliation inside the family, others feared prolonged uncertainty and public contradiction could gradually weaken confidence in the monarchy itself. According to palace administrative streams, Anne allegedly pushed for clearer structural boundaries, stricter internal discipline, and a more controlled approach toward future royal operations. And as those internal divisions deepened, one alliance reportedly became increasingly significant inside Windsor: the growing alignment between Anne and William, Prince of Wales. Several royal commentators suggest William had quietly begun embracing Anne's philosophy regarding institutional protection, particularly after years of public conflict involving Harry and Meghan. Sources close to the palace claim William viewed stability as the monarchy's highest priority, even if maintaining it required painful emotional sacrifices within the family itself. That alleged alignment reportedly strengthened Anne's position considerably behind palace walls. Yet with every new private discussion, tensions inside the royal household quietly intensified. Staff members reportedly sensed a growing divide between those still hoping for emotional healing and those preparing for a far harsher future centered entirely around survival, continuity, and control. And according to insiders, it was during this emotionally charged atmosphere that something happened behind closed doors which stunned even seasoned royal observers. Then came the moment that stunned even veteran royal observers: a deeply emotional exchange between Charles and Anne that insiders say changed everything. Sources close to Windsor claim the conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. But the emotional weight of it reportedly left senior staff shaken for days. Behind closed doors, King Charles III and Anne, Princess Royal, were said to have confronted the painful reality of mortality, legacy, and the terrifying possibility that the monarchy might not remain united after Charles's reign. According to palace whispers, the private exchange occurred during one of the most emotionally fragile periods of Charles's reign so far, as growing health concerns, succession planning, and family fractures reportedly collided behind the walls of Windsor with unbearable intensity. Several insiders claim the king entered the meeting already emotionally exhausted, carrying not only the burden of the crown but the crushing realization that time itself may no longer be operating in his favor. Reports suggest Charles spoke more openly than usual about legacy, continuity, and his fears surrounding what kind of monarchy he might leave behind for the next generation. And according to various interpretations emerging afterward, it was not the political future of the institution alone that haunted him. It was the emotional wreckage inside his own family. Sources close to royal operations claim Charles reportedly reflected on how rapidly relationships within the House of Windsor had deteriorated in recent years. Behind public statements, ceremonial appearances, and carefully controlled messaging, insiders allege the king had become increasingly devastated by the widening emotional distance between family members once expected to carry the monarchy forward together. Several commentators familiar with palace dynamics suggested Charles feared history might ultimately remember his reign not for modernization or continuity, but for a painful era of fracture and division. Yet throughout the conversation, Anne reportedly remained remarkably composed. Palace insiders claim she listened carefully while Charles spoke about uncertainty, public pressure, and the terrifying possibility that the monarchy could emerge weakened after his reign. According to sources familiar with the discussion, Anne allegedly reassured her brother that the institution itself would survive, even if personal relationships within the family never fully recovered. It was, by many accounts, a brutally honest exchange, one rooted less in comfort than in duty. Insiders whisper that Anne reminded Charles of the philosophy their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, carried throughout her 70-year reign: the monarchy must endure regardless of personal suffering. Reports suggest emotional references to both Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, became central during the discussion. Charles allegedly reflected on the extraordinary stability his parents represented, particularly during moments when public pressure threatened to overwhelm the institution entirely. According to various interpretations from palace staff, the conversation reportedly carried an almost haunting emotional undertone, as though two remaining guardians of an older royal world were confronting the painful reality that the era they once knew was beginning to disappear. Staff members allegedly noticed the impact almost immediately afterward. Several insiders claim Charles appeared visibly distressed once the meeting ended, with aides reportedly describing him as emotionally drained in a way they had rarely witnessed publicly. Even longtime palace employees familiar with royal crises allegedly sensed something profound had shifted behind closed doors. Conversations surrounding future generations reportedly became increasingly urgent in the days that followed, with attention quietly turning toward William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, as the figures expected to stabilize the monarchy moving forward. Sources suggest both William and Catherine were gradually drawn deeper into internal planning discussions, as fears surrounding continuity intensified. Royal commentators later described the meeting between Charles and Anne as historic, not because official details were ever confirmed publicly, but because insiders believed it marked the moment the monarchy emotionally accepted that a major transition was no longer a distant possibility. It was already unfolding in real time. And when the palace finally allowed the public to see Charles and Anne together again, many realized the monarchy was already entering a completely new era. The shift was subtle at first: a longer glance from William, Prince of Wales, a more central role for Catherine, Princess of Wales, a carefully orchestrated appearance beside senior royals. But insiders quickly recognized what was happening. The future of the monarchy was no longer being prepared quietly behind the scenes. It was beginning to unfold in public view. In the weeks following the emotionally charged conversations surrounding King Charles III and Anne, Princess Royal, palace operations reportedly entered a new and highly deliberate phase. According to royal commentators and sources close to Windsor, every public appearance, every carefully timed engagement, and every subtle adjustment in positioning suddenly carried enormous symbolic meaning. What once looked routine now appeared deeply strategic. And behind the carefully managed calm, insiders claim the monarchy was quietly introducing the next era before the public fully realized it. Reports suggest William increasingly emerged as the institution's future stabilizing force during this period. Palace staff allegedly noticed a visible expansion in both his responsibilities and his presence within senior-level discussions. According to several interpretations from royal insiders, William was no longer being prepared merely as the eventual king of some distant future. He was being positioned as the monarchy's immediate pillar of continuity during one of its most emotionally fragile modern chapters. That transition reportedly became especially clear during major appearances involving Charles, where William's role allegedly shifted from supportive heir to visible protector of institutional stability itself. Yet alongside William stood another figure whose growing importance insiders claim became impossible to ignore: Catherine. Throughout months of uncertainty, speculation, and emotional tension inside royal circles, Catherine was increasingly portrayed as the calm center of a deeply unsettled institution. Sources close to palace operations suggest senior aides viewed her public composure as one of the monarchy's greatest remaining assets during a period of intense emotional vulnerability. Royal commentators even began drawing comparisons between Catherine's growing symbolic role and the early years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, when stability itself became a form of reassurance for a nervous public. According to palace whispers, Charles reportedly became deeply determined to ensure any transition unfolding around him happened as smoothly and quietly as possible. Despite emotional strain and growing health concerns, insiders claim the king remained intensely focused on continuity. Sources suggest he viewed William and Catherine not only as the monarchy's future leaders, but as its best chance of preserving public trust through an era already burdened by uncertainty and division. That urgency allegedly shaped nearly every major internal discussion taking place behind palace walls. Meanwhile, Anne reportedly continued operating in the background with the same cold discipline insiders had come to associate with her role inside the monarchy. According to several royal commentators, she quietly intensified efforts to mentor the next generation, particularly William, regarding the brutal realities of protecting an institution constantly exposed to emotional and political pressure. Palace staff allegedly viewed Anne as the bridge between the old royal world shaped by Queen Elizabeth and the uncertain future now emerging under William's eventual reign. And as this quiet transfer of responsibility accelerated, public appearances reportedly became far more intentional in tone and structure. Royal watchers noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in palace messaging. Themes of continuity, resilience, sacrifice, and generational duty increasingly dominated official narratives. The monarchy was no longer simply presenting itself as surviving a difficult chapter. According to insiders, it was carefully teaching the public how to emotionally accept a transformation already underway. Comparisons to Queen Elizabeth II's early preparation years reportedly intensified as commentators observed the palace slowly reshaping public perception around William and Catherine's future leadership. Yet beneath the carefully managed unity, the emotional pressure inside the royal family allegedly remained immense. Because while the institution appeared determined to move forward, one painful truth still lingered unresolved behind closed doors. But even as the palace projected unity, one final emotional truth still remained unspoken, and it would soon define the monarchy's future forever. More than titles, palaces, or ceremonies, insiders claim King Charles III fears one thing above all else: being remembered as the monarch who could not hold his family together. Reports suggest that fear has haunted him throughout his reign, growing heavier as illness, public pressure, and internal fractures pushed the monarchy into unfamiliar territory. According to palace whispers, those closest to Charles increasingly noticed a profound emotional shift in him during the later stages of his reign. While public appearances continued projecting composure and continuity, insiders claim the king privately struggled beneath the unbearable weight of division inside the House of Windsor. Sources familiar with royal operations suggest Charles had long understood the burden of the crown, but what reportedly devastated him most was the possibility that his reign could ultimately become defined by separation rather than unity. Behind ceremonial duties and carefully managed statements, commentators claim Charles became consumed by a deeply personal fear, that future generations might remember him not as a stabilizing monarch, but as a father and brother unable to prevent his family from breaking apart under global scrutiny. Reports suggest the emotional damage caused by ongoing tensions involving Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, continued haunting palace discussions at the highest levels. Insiders claim every public interview, every memoir revelation, and every renewed media controversy reportedly deepened feelings of exhaustion inside royal circles already struggling to maintain stability during Charles's illness. Yet according to several interpretations emerging from palace staff, the king's greatest anxiety was not simply public embarrassment. It was the growing realization that emotional trust inside the family itself may have fractured beyond repair. Royal commentators increasingly began drawing haunting parallels between the atmosphere surrounding Charles's reign and the emotionally devastating turmoil that engulfed the monarchy during the era of Diana, Princess of Wales. Sources close to Windsor reportedly feared history was beginning to repeat itself in a different but equally dangerous form. Another chapter where emotional wounds inside the royal family threatened to overwhelm the institution's carefully maintained image of unity and permanence. Several insiders even claimed older palace staff quietly compared the emotional tension inside royal corridors to some of the darkest periods of the 1990s, when fear, mistrust, and public scrutiny seemed to follow the monarchy relentlessly. Yet while Charles reportedly carried the emotional burden of reconciliation, Anne, Princess Royal, allegedly remained focused on something far colder and more unforgiving: preserving institutional dignity at all costs. Palace insiders claim Anne viewed emotional instability as one of the monarchy's greatest vulnerabilities, particularly during moments when public confidence already felt fragile. According to various interpretations from royal commentators, she believed the institution could survive heartbreak, criticism, and even scandal, but only if discipline and continuity remained intact. Meanwhile, William, Prince of Wales, reportedly found himself trapped between two difficult realities. On one side stood the pressure to modernize the monarchy for a changing world. On the other stood the fear that moving too far from tradition could weaken the very structure he would one day inherit. Sources suggest William increasingly viewed stability as inseparable from survival, particularly during a period when emotional tensions inside the family continued threatening the monarchy's image globally. As this fragile balancing act intensified, public sympathy for Charles reportedly began growing in unexpected ways. According to several royal commentators, many observers who once viewed Charles primarily through the shadow of past controversies now saw an aging king visibly burdened by illness, legacy, and family pain unfolding in full public view. Yet despite outward displays of continuity, palace insiders repeatedly described the atmosphere behind closed doors using the same haunting phrase, emotionally fragile. Staff allegedly sensed that nearly every conversation inside the royal household now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty, as though the institution itself stood suspended between endurance and irreversible transformation. And then, finally, came the statement that many now believe was not just emotional, but a warning about the future of the crown itself. Standing beside Anne, Princess Royal, King Charles III reportedly understood something the world was only beginning to realize. The monarchy had entered a moment from which there would be no return. The age of quiet stability was over. What came next would depend entirely on whether duty could survive where family bonds had begun to fracture. In the days following Charles's deeply emotional statement, royal commentators and palace insiders increasingly began describing the moment not simply as another carefully managed appearance, but as something far more historic and unsettling, a transition unfolding in real time before the public fully understood its significance. According to various interpretations emerging from palace circles, Charles's words were never intended to function solely as reassurance. They reportedly carried the emotional weight of a warning. Because behind the carefully chosen language about sacrifice, continuity, and future generations, stood a monarch painfully aware that the institution he inherited was entering one of the most uncertain chapters in modern royal history. Reports suggest Charles had come to realize that the monarchy could no longer rely on silence alone to preserve its authority. The emotional fractures inside the House of Windsor had become too visible, too public, and too emotionally charged to simply disappear behind palace walls. And according to insiders, that realization changed the tone of everything. Throughout this period, Anne reportedly emerged not only as Charles's closest institutional ally, but as the symbolic guardian of continuity itself. Palace insiders increasingly portrayed her as the final living bridge between the older royal world shaped by Queen Elizabeth II and the uncertain future now taking shape under the next generation. Sources familiar with royal operations suggest Anne's quiet discipline became a stabilizing force during moments when emotional pressure inside the monarchy threatened to overwhelm even senior figures. To many within palace corridors, she represented something increasingly rare inside modern royal life: unwavering loyalty to duty regardless of personal pain. Yet while Anne symbolized continuity, insiders claim the future itself was gradually being placed into the hands of William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales. According to several royal commentators, the palace had already begun subtly reshaping public perception around the couple, presenting them less as future heirs waiting in the background and more as the emotional and institutional foundation of the monarchy's next era. Public appearances reportedly became increasingly symbolic in tone, designed to project resilience, calm, and continuity during a time of emotional uncertainty. Sources close to Windsor suggest William was viewed internally as the figure expected to modernize the monarchy without allowing it to lose the discipline and structure that had preserved it for generations. Catherine, meanwhile, reportedly became one of the institution's most powerful emotional stabilizers, with palace staff allegedly viewing her composure and public image as critical to maintaining public trust during a fragile transition period. Throughout these discussions, the shadow of Queen Elizabeth reportedly remained everywhere. Insiders claim her philosophy regarding service, restraint, and institutional survival continued guiding private conversations at the highest levels of the royal household. Royal commentators repeatedly invoked her legacy while analyzing the monarchy's transformation, suggesting that many inside the palace were now attempting to preserve the final pieces of stability created during her 70-year reign. But according to palace whispers, the atmosphere had already changed permanently. Public perception of the monarchy itself reportedly began shifting from one of unquestioned permanence towards something more emotional, fragile, and human. Commentators increasingly described the emergence of a new royal era, one defined not only by ceremony and tradition, but by survival under extraordinary emotional pressure. And beneath all the symbolism, all the carefully managed appearances, and all the public efforts to project unity, one truth reportedly remained at the heart of everything. The monarchy's future would depend entirely on whether sacrifice could still outweigh division. Because within the House of Windsor, insiders whisper that crowns are never truly inherited peacefully. They are protected through sacrifice, silence, and the unforgiving weight of duty itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.